Welcome to The Debate. Imagine a threat actor breaches your network literally today. Are they stealing operational data from, last month? Or are they quietly downloading some forgotten 10-year-old server backup that just happens to contain the sensitive personal information of millions of past clients?
Yeah, the stuff nobody even remembers is there. I'm Supa, by the way.
And I'm Put. Today we're doing something a little different. We are launching a very special thematic focus on the show called the Governance Root Series.
Right, and the core philosophy here is really designed for C-level executives and the board of directors. We want to show that, a lot of the operational security or privacy fires that teams are constantly fighting down in the server room, they actually have their true root causes sitting squarely at the governance level in the boardroom.
Exactly, Supa. And the issue we are unpacking today is, honestly, perhaps the most pervasive, silent crisis in modern enterprise architecture. We're looking at the source material titled Data Minimization Loses to Might Need It Later, specifically case SG-109.
Which is such a great title, because this is the exact topic that gets completely glazed over in board meetings. They just treat it as mere IT housekeeping, but it fundamentally dictates the survival of the enterprise during a crisis.
It is far, far more than housekeeping. So the central question we are debating today is this. Is the endless accumulation of unstructured data primarily a failure of board-level governance that creates this urgent, compounding strategic liability? Or, Supa, as I believe you're going to argue, is it a highly rational operational response to the inherent risks of deleting things?
That is exactly the tension we need to explore, Put. I'll be taking the stance that until organizational cultures fundamentally shift, keeping data indefinitely is the only rational defensive choice for working-level teams. That might need it later instinct. It isn't a policy gap. It's not a failure of intellect. It is a completely valid operational reality born out of sheer self-preservation in a highly litigious environment.
Okay, and I will be arguing that data hoarding is an unmanaged, massive strategic risk. It's a profound governance failure where unmade decisions just silently inflate future liabilities. My position is that until the board makes data deletion an owned, scheduled, and recorded decision, they are actively failing in their fiduciary duty.
Strong words.
Well, let's get right into it then. Data minimization is literally one of the oldest yet most universally ignored data protection principles on the planet. And the reason organizations fail at it is entirely structural. Keeping data is viewed as a safe, passive act, right?
Right. It takes zero effort.
Exactly. It requires no approval, no signature, no moment of commitment. It just happens by default. But deleting data? That requires an active intervention. It requires someone to put their actual name on a decision that could be heavily scrutinized years later. So because there is no deliberate, governed deletion process, stored data undergoes this sort of phase change. It stops being a business asset and turns into what we really should call toxic data.
Toxic data. I like that.
It is. It's information that has lost 100% of its business value, but it retains 100% of its liability value. This toxic data is a strategic risk that inflates the blast radius of every single future breach. It exponentially increases discovery costs during litigation, and it just magnifies regulatory exposure under frameworks like GDPR or CCPA. So the root cause is a failure at the governance level. The board has to step in and dictate the organization's risk appetite regarding stale data. They have to mandate that deletion is an owned, scheduled, and recorded control. It can't just be an absence of action left to the IT department.
Okay, I understand the theoretical appeal of that position. I really do. But the reality on the ground is entirely different. Look, I agree that endless data retention is problematic. And yeah, the liability is growing. But I completely disagree with the idea that top-down board mandates or just declaring data toxic is some silver bullet here.
It's the necessary first step, though.
Is it? Think about the mechanics of how a business actually operates. The hoarding instinct is a survival mechanism. You have a mid-level IT or compliance manager who gets told to execute a deletion schedule. As you said yourself, that is an active decision. Now, if they delete a 5-year-old email archive and then 6 months later the legal department desperately needs that exact archive to defend against a massive class action lawsuit, who gets fired?
Well, obviously.
Policies. Or drafting fancy risk appetite statements
in the boardroom, or citing international frameworks. None of that matters if you don't provide genuine psychological and operational safety nets for the people executing the deletion. You can mandate deletion all day long, but if you don't change the culture of blame and if the board doesn't explicitly shield the people executing these policies, the hoarding will simply find a new place to hide.
Hide where?
Oh, everywhere. Shadow IT, local hard drives, unsanctioned cloud buckets. People will squirrel the data away to protect themselves.
Atsupa, that fear of blame you keep mentioning, that is exactly why this cannot be left to middle management anymore. The exposure has just grown way too large for the board to ignore it. Let's ground this in the central metaphor from the source material because I think it perfectly illustrates this governance failure. Enterprise data has become a basement of boxes nobody opens and everyone insures.
It's a vivid image, sure.
It's reality. Think about what an organization is actively doing. You are paying for premium cloud storage, you're paying for advanced security controls, you're paying massive cyber insurance premiums, all to protect a digital basement full of cardboard boxes that literally haven't been opened in a decade. I emphasize this to boards constantly. Keeping data without a current purpose isn't caution, it is actively accumulating strategic risk. But let me just finish the thought. If a threat actor breaches your perimeter, the difference between them exfiltrating 2 years of relevant customer data versus 15 years of unpurged historical data, that's the difference between a manageable PR crisis and an existential catastrophe. When a regulator sees that you lost 10 years of data you didn't even need to be holding, the negligence fines just skyrocket.
Okay, I have to push back on that metaphor right there, because the basement of useless boxes completely ignores how a business actually survives regulatory scrutiny. Let me offer a different analogy.
Go ahead.
That basement isn't full of old junk. It's a highly flammable, hazardous waste facility. Yes, I'll grant you that. But it's one that contains trace minerals the company might desperately need to extract to save its own life.
Trace minerals, really?
Yes, organizations frequently do need to dig through those old boxes. But have you ever been part of a sudden litigation hold or an unexpected tax audit that goes back 7 years? In those moments, those dusty boxes in the basement are literally the only thing standing between the company and massive financial penalties. How can a board definitively assign an expiry date to a class of unstructured data, let's say, internal project communications, when the future legal value of that data is often entirely unknown at the time it's created? You're asking employees and even the board to possess a crystal ball.
No, I'm not. They don't need a crystal ball, Supa. They need a defensible framework. And actually, your flammable waste analogy proves my point perfectly.
How so?
Because no rational factory stores highly flammable explosive waste inside their main production facility indefinitely just because there's a 1 in a million chance they might need to extract a trace mineral from it a decade later. The risk of the factory burning down far outweighs the hypothetical mineral value. This brings us to how actual governance frameworks handle this. Look at ISO IEC 38500, specifically Principle 5.
Conformance, right?
Exactly. Conformance. The standard mandates that data must only be held for purposes that can be justified and demonstrated today, not retained by default based on some hypothetical, unquantifiable future need. Data kept just in case has no current justification. It represents an unmade decision. If you cannot articulate a current business purpose or a specific regulatory requirement for keeping a record, you are violating foundational governance principles. You aren't managing risk, you're just deferring a decision because making it feels uncomfortable.
But uncomfortable drastically undersells the reality when the consequences of a mistake are apocalyptic. You mentioned the factory burning down, so let's look at the actual financial exposure on both sides of this equation. The frameworks argue that keeping this data is a severe drain on resources, but let's quantify that drain versus the alternative.
It is a massive drain, and the source material provides a very clear lens for this. The case outlines a specific illustrative breakdown of these hidden compounding costs. Let me lay it out.
Sure.
We are looking at $680,000 for the storage and management of expired data. We see $1.2 million for the breach blast radius, meaning the scope of exposure inflated specifically by data that should have been deleted. Add to that $540,000 for discovery and legal hold costs over a bloated estate, and finally, $410,000 for privacy and regulatory exposure on stale records.
Right.
Now, Supa, I want to be incredibly clear here, especially for the audit committee members and executives listening. These numbers, which total about $2.8 million annually in this scenario, they are not actual benchmark figures.
Exactly. You can't just plug them into your budget.
No, you can't. They are illustrative estimates. They are specifically highlighted in the material to prompt organizations to reflect on these hidden compounding costs. They are a tool to make the invisible cost visible to the board, but the underlying mechanism is undeniable. Every record kept past its purpose enlarges your financial exposure.
I'm really glad you clarified that they are illustrative. Because even if we take that $2.8 million figure at face value, we have to look at the asymmetry of the risk here put. That $2.8 million is a known, relatively manageable operational drag. For a large enterprise, it's just a cost of doing business. It's essentially an insurance premium they are willing to pay to avoid a fatal error.
A fatal error being what, a fine?
A fatal error being spoliation of evidence. Let's talk about that legal reality. If an organization accidentally deletes a single class of data that is later required by a court, or say an SEC probe, the judge can instruct the jury to assume that the deleted data contained the worst possible facts for the company. That is spoliation. An accidental deletion executed by a perfectly well-meaning retention schedule could result in a $50 million, $100 million, or even $1 billion judgment against the enterprise.
But that's...
Let me finish. The asymmetry of risk makes hoarding the logical default. That $2.8 million drag is absolutely nothing compared to a catastrophic fine for missing evidence. You can't just wave away the very real terror that legal and compliance teams feel when you talk about aggressive automated deletion schedules.
I am certainly not waving it away. I'm saying that the governance structure is explicitly designed to absorb that terror. This is exactly what we mean by the governance route. When a deletion schedule is approved by the board, documented, and executed systematically in the normal course of business, it provides a safe harbor against claims of spoliation. Courts recognize the difference between malicious destruction of evidence and routine, governed data lifecycle management.
In theory.
In practice, let's look at NIST CSF 2.0. The updated framework elevates governance to the center of its core. It shifted data from being viewed merely as an IT asset to being part of a governed risk lifecycle. Or look at the EU's Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA. The message across modern regulation is clear. Over-retention is an unmanaged risk decision. You call hoarding a logical default, Supa. But from a governance perspective, a default is simply the absence of a decision.
The solution is explicit management accountability. We need retention schedules that actually execute. We need systematic reporting to the board detailing exactly what data is being held beyond its stated purpose and why. Deletion must be treated as an essential security control. It's no different than a firewall, or encryption, or access management. It cannot remain a clerical task left to the discretion of an anxious middle manager.
And here is where your pristine frameworks completely crash into architectural and human reality, Poot.
How so?
Let's start with the human element, because the source text includes this brilliant governance maturity self-check. It asks provocative questions like, when did a retention schedule last actually delete data with a record? Or who owns the decision to delete a class of data, and is it ever exercised? If an organization answers yes to only 0 to 2 of these questions, the text explicitly states they are managed by hope.
Exactly.
And let's be fiercely honest with ourselves here. 95% of organizations today are managed by hope.
Which is exactly why the board needs to intervene. If you are managed by hope, you are fundamentally failing your shareholders.
But forcing a top-down intervention doesn't change the underlying physics of the organization. I challenge you on this. If you force a data owner to sign off on a deletion just to satisfy NIST CSF 2.0, aren't you just painting a massive target on their back? You say governance absorbs the terror and provides a safe harbor in court. That might be true for the corporation as a legal entity, sure. But in practice, internal corporate governance usually just assigns a specific name to the scapegoat when things go wrong.
That is a very cynical view of governance.
It's the reality of corporate survival. The environment has to change so that deleting on schedule is actively rewarded. It needs to be treated as rigorous compliance, rather than being viewed as a localized career risk to avoid. Until the board publicly and legally protects the people pulling the trigger on data deletion, those retention schedules you love so much will remain pure decoration.
Okay, you're identifying a real cultural problem, Supa, but your conclusion creates a circular trap. You are essentially arguing that we cannot govern data deletion until the culture changes, but the culture will never change until the governance mandates it and changes the incentive structures.
But
Hear me out. The board's role isn't just to rubber stamp a policy. It's to make the expectation visible and alter the operational calculus of the entire company. When the audit committee asks the CISO and the general counsel, what data are we still storing only because deleting it felt riskier than keeping it, they are fundamentally changing the psychological safety of the environment right there.
well, maybe.
Definitely. Under a proper governance structure, when that mid-level manager deletes the 5-year-old email archive, they aren't taking a personal risk. They are executing a board-approved control. If the data is later needed, the liability sits with the governing body that approved the risk appetite and the retention schedule, not the employee who executed it. That is what true governance achieves. It shifts the liability from the individual up to the directors, where it actually belongs.
I agree that is the ideal state of governance. But let's shift from the human element to the architectural entanglement, because this is where the execution actually falls apart. What teams see on the ground is that data volumes only ever grow, right? And almost nothing is ever deleted because deleting it is technically fraught.
Fraught how?
Because if you want to shrink the breach exposure when data passes its retention point, you have to acknowledge the complexity of modern enterprise architecture. Data doesn't just sit in neatly labeled cardboard boxes anymore. It is completely entangled. You have microservices pulling from shared data lakes. You have unstructured data replicated across multiple geographic availability zones.
Sure, but
You have immutable backups. Backups designed specifically to prevent ransomware from deleting data, which means your own IT team can't easily delete it either. It's tied into machine learning training sets where, unpicking one user's historical data corrupts the entire model. So the hesitation to delete isn't just psychological, it is deeply architectural. The risk of breaking a production system by executing a blunt deletion script is immediate and guaranteed, whereas the risk of a breach is hypothetical, right up until the moment it isn't.
okay. But Supa, don't you see that this architectural entanglement is precisely the symptom of ungoverned data?
No, it's just how systems are built today.
But it shouldn't be. The only reason it is so technically difficult to delete a record is because the organization never designed the system with an end-of-life process in mind in the first place. If a system is so entangled that you cannot surgically remove expired data without collapsing an ML model or breaking an API, it is because governance was completely absent during the design and procurement phases.
That's easy to say in hindsight.
It's what we have to fix now. This is exactly why it is a governance root issue. You are describing the symptoms of a disease that started in the boardroom when they approved an IT architecture that prioritized ingestion and storage over lifecycle management. And the exposure is not abstract. When a threat actor infiltrates a network and compromises millions of rows of PII that should have been purged 3 years ago, the regulator doesn't care about the manager's psychological safety. And they certainly do not care about your architectural entanglement.
No, they don't.
They ask for the execution logs of the retention schedule. And when those are missing, or when the answer is, oh, our data lake made it too hard to delete, the fines are catastrophic and the reputational damage is irreversible.
Look, I do not disagree that the regulatory pressure is mounting, and the privacy exposure on stale records is a ticking time bomb. I see that. But the reality remains that asking a team to untangle a decade of architectural debt right now under the current incentive structures, where keeping data is passive and deleting it breaks systems, is a massive uphill battle. People get promoted for building data lakes, not for draining them.
Well, they should.
Maybe, but they don't. So when you bring in ISO or NIST frameworks that demand minimization is evidenced by schedules that actually execute, you're asking for a profound behavioral and technical revolution. You're asking people to act against their immediate local self-interest for the abstract long-term benefit of reducing the company's breach blast radius.
Exactly, yes. And managing long-term, abstract strategic risk over short-term local comfort is the literal definition of the board's job. Without a current purpose and an expiry date, every class of data will be retained indefinitely by inertia. When the board requires a stated reason and a future review date for keeping data, the entire dynamic reverses. Keeping must be justified, not merely assumed.
Right.
So as we draw to a close here, let's just summarize the core of our positions. I maintain that data kept just in case is a guaranteed cost against a mere possibility of use. It is an unmanaged liability, plain and simple. True governance requires making deletion an owned, defensible decision. It requires schedules that actually run, architectures built to support them, and reporting that makes the true cost of over-retention visible to the board. Shrinking the enterprise's strategic exposure is not merely an IT problem to be solved with more storage, it is a governance mandate.
Fair enough. And I maintain that while those frameworks are logically sound, and yes, the board-level mandates are necessary, they consistently fail to account for the deeply ingrained human and architectural resistance on the ground. Mandates will fail unless they actively, explicitly protect the people pulling the trigger, and unless the business provides the engineering resources that actually untangle the data. The asymmetry of risk, the sheer terror of destroying crucial legal evidence versus the slow drip of storage costs means that until the culture shifts to reward deletion, hoarding will remain the most rational, defensive choice for the operational teams.
Reached a vital point of convergence today, Supa. Despite our different approaches to the solution, we both agree on the core governance root principle at play here. As long as keeping data remains a passive, default state and deleting data requires a risky, active intervention, the enterprise's data estate and its corresponding toxic liability will continue to grow purely by inertia.
Absolutely. We agree entirely on the mechanics of the trap, even if we weigh the human, architectural, and structural elements differently. For the listeners out there, especially C-suite leaders, audit committee members, and the board, we highly encourage you to take the governance maturity self-check from today's material back to your organizations. Ask your teams the hard questions. When did a retention schedule last actually delete data with a record? Stop allowing the organization to be managed by hope. Uncover your own exposure before a threat actor or a regulator uncovers it for you.
Indeed, don't let your data estate become a liability accruing interest in a digital basement nobody visits, because eventually someone is going to open that door and you are not going to like what they find in the dark. Thank you for joining us on this Governance Root edition of The Debate. Until next time.